Greetings, everybody. It's Thursday, September 26th, and we've got some Chapo coming at you. I have, of course, rushed home from the human shield wall I'd constructed to defend Eric Adams from his ongoing persecutions. Felix, I know you've booked a flight to New York and will be joining me in the Eric Adams defense immediately.
I'm taking the quickest layover I can do, which is Los Angeles to Istanbul to New York.
I just
only a 28-hour flight.
We'll have to save a full breakdown of the Eric Adams indictment to a future episode. But I will say my favorite detail in it is in the communications between his staff and Turkish Airlines. When Turkish Airlines is like, yeah, this is all comped, and they're like, no. You got to make it look legitimate. $50 for a flight is too that looks bad. A lot of eyes are on Eric Adams. They were like, okay, how about $1,000? And they were like, okay. And the flight was a business class round trip to Istanbul that was worth $15,000.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of working for a new media company when I was doing Carl Diggler, in that, like, when you work for a new media company, there are so many people who are trying to justify their position that they're just constantly suggesting things that don't make any sense and don't need to be suggested. Kind of like this. And it's very nice to see that, like, municipal corruption works the same way. Whoever suggested that the flight should be arbitrarily $1,000 to avoid setting off suspicions, which, by the way, mission not accomplished. If we're reading this in a federal indictment, mission very much not accomplished. That is someone who is like, no, I deserve to be in this corruption ring. Let me show you why.
Eric Adams, New York's first WeWork mayor.
Well, on today's show, Felix and I are joined once again by Mohammad Alsaafin from AJ Plus. And like I said, we got to save Eric Adams for another day because, Mohammad, we wanted to have you on because it was, almost a year ago that we had you on. I think it was right after October 7th happened. And this was also probably, I think, if not our first, then one of our first episodes back doing the show since Matt's stroke. But it was like, we got hit with Matt's stroke, and then immediately one of the most serious and grave matters of, like, international importance was just, became the news. And now, Mohammed, it's been now almost a year since October 7th. And when we talked to you on the program, we talked about what actually happened on October 7th and, what Hamas's strategy and like how they did what they did. And we could only guess really at what the next year would hold, but we could, we had some idea of what was coming. And since that year, it has been, one nightmare after another. And I want to begin today with an article that you posted earlier today. This is an interview that our friends at Dropsite News put up with Dr. Zahir Al-Wahidi, who is the director of information for the Ministry of Health in Gaza. And all we have really in the whole year of this is just the numbers of lives lost, which according to the Ministry of Health is officially documented, stands at around 41,000. But Mohammed, what was it like in sharing this article? What were the sort of the details about this interview that caught your eye?
Well, I mean, first of all, one of the things that caught my eye was the fact that the interview even happened, because in the English language and Western media, especially over the last year, a lot of doubt is cast on the figures coming out of Gaza by labeling everything recorded by the Ministry of Health there as the Hamas-run Ministry of Health. So when you put that qualifier there, you're signaling to your audience that you can't really trust these guys. They're just making shit up. What this interview showed me was the insane amount of professional detail that the ministry is going through to record every single person being killed in circumstances which are unfathomable, which I think most people would forgive them if they made a few mistakes or flubbed things here or there. The number by the metrics that they're giving, it's definitely an undercount. It's definitely very conservative. So one of the things that stood out to me was the fact that people who die of disease or of preventable illnesses, people who are no longer able to get cancer treatment because Gaza's only cancer hospital has been turned into a military base by the Israelis, or people who can't get dialysis because the hospitals have been destroyed. Those people don't count in the official figures. So we don't know how many. They say they record them as deaths, but they don't record them as as deaths as direct consequence of the war. The only deaths that they count as a consequence of the war, the 42,000 that we have right now, are people that they've been able to physically identify as having been shot or killed in a missile strike. So 42,000 people that we know at least have died just through that method.
Yeah, it's a very clarifying interview because of the meticulous nature in which life and death is recorded, as you mentioned, under unimaginable circumstances. But I mean, and I believe like just yesterday we saw footage coming in of what I take as a fairly regular occurrence of Israeli tractor trailers just unloading dozens and dozens and hundreds of bodies in body bags, unidentified, in Gaza, and just saying, "Here, pick them up."
Yeah.
I mean, what do we know about that? Do we even know where these bodies are coming from?
No. So one of the horrors that kind of just gets elided in the headlines and the stories coming out of Gaza is the fact that, and this was alluded to in the interview with the doctor about how the ministry is counting all the deaths, is that there are thousands of people missing and nobody knows who they are, where they are. And I can tell you, speaking to relatives in Gaza, there are people, relatives, friends that have just disappeared and no one knows where they are. And the hope for most people, the hope that people hold on to, is that they are in one of the Israeli torture camps, because all the people who get picked up have been arrested. There's no processing. There's no Red Cross. There's no identification. There's no clarification as to their fates. People are taken and either come back in body bags or come back or get dumped on the crossings and make their way back in. So, it seems to be a regular occurrence where trucks are just kind of unloaded into Gaza with bodies, no identification of who the bodies are, where they came from, what happened to them, how they were killed. The Israelis refuse to provide that information. And in many cases, the bodies are in such a bad state of decomposition that it's impossible to identify who they are.
Another thing over this last year, U.S. policy has remained pretty much unchanged. Like, we want to support Israel, and Israel's self-defense is of utmost importance. They're fighting this war against Hamas. But in the early days, in terms of the objectives of this war, it was about getting the hostages back and making sure that something like October 7th could not happen again. Well, we know the situation with the hostages. The ones they haven't killed, they've gotten a few of them back at this point. But how do you assess Israel's stated military objectives versus what they've actually achieved? And going further than that, if these military objectives, i.e., the safety and security of these hostages being held, is not really the strategy they're pursuing here, what is the strategy? What accounts for what we're seeing?
It's a good question. I think when we spoke last a year ago, the Israelis had talked about destroying Hamas, making sure that they could never be a threat to Israel again, et cetera, and it was clear to anyone who had an understanding of what Hamas was, how it operated, its status as a national movement, that you don't destroy that through military means. And I think belatedly you're seeing U.S. officials saying that, accepting that. But I think at the time, the Israelis managed to convince them that this was doable, that, a massive blitz of bombardment in Gaza would bring Hamas to its knees and they could pick them off, kill the leadership. And that hasn't happened. And so we've kind of entered a state almost a year on where Gaza as a place has been decimated, where Gaza as a place where people live is no longer fit for human habitation. And this comes after almost 20 years of siege. But Hamas itself still exists. It's still launching attacks on Israeli soldiers in Gaza. The command and control structure doesn't seem to have been adversely affected. And every time, or in places where it seems like it had been, they were able to quickly regroup and reorganize themselves. And it's turning into an insurgency. The Israelis are sitting in Gaza, but not able to do much. They're holding kind of two corridors in Gaza, one cutting Gaza in two in the central area and one on the border with Egypt. But they're not able to kind of extend their influence into any of the population centers. It's a stalemate in that sense, in a strategic sense. And I think Hamas's calculation is that at some point, the Israelis will have to leave. Now, as for the hostages, I think it was clear from very early on. The hostages were a boon to the Israeli war effort, right? They were good to kind of present to the international community, to the world. This is what our war is about recovering our hostages. We know now that on day 2, day 3, the families of the hostages themselves have come out and said this, that Hamas offered to return most of the hostages if Israel did not, enter Gaza militarily and then conduct a prisoner swap for the remaining hostages who were taken. Israel chose not to do that, not to take up that offer. And what has happened is that the only time we've seen a mass release of Israeli captives was during the 1-week ceasefire in November. And ever since then, we've seen more hostages killed, either by their captors or by Israeli bombardment.
So if that's what we're left with, and as you alluded to, the copious amounts of reporting, specifically in the Israeli press, about how the negotiations for the return of hostages have been sabotaged at basically every single juncture by Netanyahu's government, because
by Netanyahu specifically.
By him specifically, because if they were to be returned, then the stated reason for this war would be off the table. And then, it's very clear for his internal political reasons. And again, we know the internal political reasons about why he wants to keep this war going, to stay out of jail, to stay in power, etc. But does that capture the whole picture of this policy here, of extermination, essentially?
No, I think it gives the Israeli public a little too much credit. I think this war is very, very popular with the Israeli public, and even though you'll see reports about massive protests in Tel Aviv every now and then by people who want a ceasefire deal, the war itself and the destruction of Gaza have shown in poll after poll to be extremely popular. The dehumanization, the torture of Palestinians, the mass killing. Very, very popular. And so it's not just that if the war ends that Netanyahu will be on his way out. By the way, polls also show that Netanyahu has now become the most popular political figure in Israel a year on. So he kind of managed to weather the initial storm of criticism that he faced in the aftermath of October 7th, and is once again the most popular politician in Israel. So even those factors are kind of losing their importance. I think the war has become what's the word? The war has become self-sustaining, right? The reason we're at war is because there is a war. That's essentially how it's being framed. And so, going back to the hostages more than anything have become a nuisance to Netanyahu and to the Israeli government. They're a cudgel with which his opponents, his domestic opponents, can attack him with. But he'd much rather just focus on fighting Gaza and expanding this war to Lebanon.
As it stands right now, what would be what are the conditions by which the leadership of Hamas have laid out for a ceasefire deal that they would accept, in terms of what are the conditions that need to be met for that they say that they will return at least the civilian hostages?
They want what Joe Biden wants, apparently. Joe Biden put out a ceasefire proposal, and they've repeatedly said, we will adhere to President Biden's proposal. Ironically, as you guys know, Biden presented that as Netanyahu's proposal instead of his own, and then Netanyahu just shat all over it. The conditions that Hamas have laid out are, or the overall parameters of that are that there would be obviously cessation of fighting. The Israelis would withdraw from Gaza, from the places where they are currently located. There would be a prisoner exchange over several stages, and that there would be an official end to the war, and Gaza would be, as U.S. officials like to say, flooded with aid. So that's the proposal. It's been pretty consistent from last year till now, and hasn't really changed. And it matches what the U.S. has said would be their vision for a ceasefire.
Now, when we have to consider Hamas in the West and filter through the Western media, they're described as a ruthless terrorist group that targets innocent civilians, and that they are more than anything like an avatar of an ancient religious conflict. But the thing is, in terms of world history and even the history of the Israeli-Palestine conflict, Hamas is a relatively new group. They emerged in the 1980s, and I was wondering if you could provide some context for what were the conditions that Hamas arose out of, and specifically, I'm thinking about the life of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, and just the conditions of that individual's life that he experienced, that led to him becoming in terms of, if an individual's life reflects the goals, history, and context of a political national movement, what can we glean from this one man's life in terms of like the reasons Hamas exists and their goals and like their objectives in being like forming an armed resistance.
So Yahya Sinwar obviously is now the leader of Hamas. He succeeded Ismail Haniyeh, who was assassinated at the end of end of July, beginning of August, by the Israelis this year. Yahya Sinwar, like you said, his story does kind of reflect the rise and the growth of the group. In the late 80s, he was arrested by the Israelis and sentenced to multiple life sentences. He was at the time operating in Gaza. He's from the southern city of Khan Yunis, a refugee, and he was going after Israeli collaborators. And I believe he was responsible for the deaths of several, and that's what the Israelis had indicted him for and sentenced him to life in jail for. Sinwar was pretty much out of the picture in the 90s and 2000s because he was in jail. But he wasn't a well-known name. He wasn't a household name amongst Palestinians, but he was a leader in the prisoner movement inside Israeli jails. And he was actually released in a prisoner exchange when Hamas captured an Israeli soldier in 2006, held onto him for 5 years and exchanged him for 1,000 Palestinian prisoners in 2011. The most senior name on that list was Yahya Sinwar. He came out and within a couple of years was elected within Hamas to be the group's leader in Gaza. Sinwar speaks fluent Hebrew. He taught himself Hebrew when he was in Israeli jail. So he
even translated a couple books from Hebrew into Arabic, right?
Yeah, I believe he translated the memoirs of several kind of leaders of Israeli security agencies, Shin Bet and so on, into Arabic. So he taught himself. There's even a TV interview with Israeli TV that he conducted from the jail yard in Hebrew. So fluent Hebrew speaker, so understands Israeli society pretty well, but has always been seen as one of the more militant figures in Hamas. In 2018, there's a really revealing interview that he conducted with an Italian journalist that was then translated into several Israeli newspapers. Where this was, do you guys remember the Great March of Return when thousands of people for a whole year in Gaza would go out every Friday to the boundary demanding the right to return, the end of the siege, and the predictable Israeli response to this peaceful protest was to shoot the kneecaps of thousands of people and kill several hundreds. And it was during this time that Sinwar gave this interview to an Italian journalist where he talked about, and I laugh because it's so funny, it's so ironic when you consider the image that's been perpetuated of Sinwar in the Western media over the last year. He talked about a long-term truce to give a new generation, the younger generation, a chance to live in peace and figure out things because his generation, couldn't figure it out because all his generation, Israelis and Palestinians, know is conflict. And what if we lifted the siege in Gaza? What if we allowed these young people to live normal lives, to travel, to see the world, to be who they could be, and then come back and figure this out in a couple of decades? Very ironic, coming from a guy that the Western media has tried to call the butcher of Khan Yunis over the last year. I think I first saw that in the Wall Street Journal, and then it was repeated in several other outlets. It's funny to me because I am from Khan Yunis, so I ask people, I was like, is that actually what people call him? And no one had heard of this nickname before. Just made up out of whole cloth by the Wall Street Journal.
Sort of like under his tenure of leadership of Hamas, which is like an armed resistance movement, or like if you, depending on your perspective, could be called a terrorist group, but it is the government of Gaza. Under his tenure, since he's been released from prison, have the goals or strategies of Hamas changed? I mean, like I know the overall goal is the restoration of the historic Palestinian homeland, but has there been an evolution or a change in the tactics, strategy, or outlook of Hamas, like under his leadership, as opposed to whoever replaced him, or now that he's replaced Haniyeh?
Sure. So, I mean, to start at the end of that question, he replaced Haniyeh. He hasn't been seen in almost a year. He's been underground during this entire time. So I don't think he's had the chance to really shape anything strategic. But after he came out of jail and he assumed a leadership role, one of the things, and this wasn't just him, but he was part of the leadership that updated Hamas's goals, updated their charter in 2000, and 17, one of the major things was Hamas accepted a two-state solution, which again is in line with supposedly the goals of the United States, the United Nations, most Western countries, which is to have a Palestinian state just in the West Bank and Gaza. That's something that is actually in the Hamas charter. If you go online, you see a lot of pro-Israel folks tell you, read the Hamas charter, it's anti-Semitic. And if you actually read the Hamas charter of 2017, it says that they want to establish a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which is exactly what apparently which is supposedly what the State Department's preferred outcome is.
And to be clear, a Palestinian state based on just technically the West Bank and Gaza would be about like less than 20% of what was taken from them originally.
22% of historic Palestine. Yeah. So Hamas has said that they're willing to work with that. Now, what has happened since then is there's been absolutely no engagement by Israel or its benefactors, even as Hamas has changed and softened its stances. So the siege on Gaza was maintained and persisted. The isolation of Hamas was maintained and persisted. There was no engagement even as the group was changing or softening its demands. There was the multiple rounds of war on Gaza. And the last thing we saw was that, the Trump administration's proposal for solving the Middle East conflict was to create a series of Bantustans for Palestinians to work as laborers for the Israeli economy, while Israel normalized relations with the Gulf states and other Arab states. So there was no engagement and no horizon for hope presented by the U.S. or by any of Israel's benefactors. And so I think the conclusion Hamas to which led to October 7th was that they needed to shake things up, or shake things up maybe is too soft a word. They needed to blow things up. It's probably more accurate.
And speaking about the two-state solution, which is, as you said, they've already agreed to, but like that two-state solution is bandied about by, I hear it all the time from politicians in this country about like, oh, like we gave them, we had the offer for a two-state solution and they turned to terrorism. Like in 1993, the Oslo Accords, that would have been the Palestinian state and they turned it down. But like, the history there obviously is eliding a great deal. But like in terms of what's going on right now, we're seeing a escalation of land seizures and violence and just essentially pogroms in the West Bank right now, where Hamas officially has no presence. So like there are no hostages being held in the West Bank, but yet we see a dramatic increase in violence and like land seizures and, just killings in the West Bank. I mean, I saw a video last week of Israeli soldiers just chucking bodies off a rooftop in the West Bank. So like, how does the not just like the fake history of this two-state solution allied the issue here, but like, how is Israel's actions in the West Bank right now making it so that they're making sure that there will never be a Palestinian state?
Well, there'll never be a Palestinian state because physically it's impossible to have a Palestinian state in the West Bank, because the West Bank is crisscrossed with Israeli settlements. 1 in 10 Israelis lives, or 1 in 10 Jewish Israelis, I should say, lives in the West Bank. That's about 700,000 Israelis, many of them Americans, by the way. And these Israeli settlements, they're presented as kind of like suburban neighborhoods. What they are essentially fortified settlements, colonies, in between Palestinian towns and villages, with systems of infrastructure, military infrastructure, their own road system, et cetera, that have cut up the West Bank into tiny little pockets of Palestinian population. So you have the Palestinian population in the West Bank is corralled into ever decreasing zones surrounded by checkpoints, by walls, by fences, by these colonies that are armed, protected by the Israeli army, that have heavily armed Israeli settlers living there. And so for there to be a state, you need a contiguous landmass in the West Bank. And that means removing all these settlers and their infrastructure. And I don't see Israel removing the infrastructure it spent the last 60 years building there. These settlers are given tax subsidies. They're given rent subsidies to move there. It's a project of the state to settle the West Bank. And it's reached a point now where the facts on the ground mean that it's physically impossible for there to be a Palestinian state unless, hundreds of thousands of Israelis are removed by force. So that's when we look at like the physical reasons why there won't be a state in the West Bank. The problem with partition, and even with, with the idea of a two-state solution, is that partition has been presented from before Israel's creation as a solution to the problem of how to create a Jewish state in a place that does not have a majority Jewish population, right? And so when Palestine was under British occupation from 1917 until 1948, the British tried several times to put forward proposals to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. And the British never went through with it because they knew it would be a failure, because they knew that the Jewish population, who were at the time mostly European immigrants, recently arrived, was so much smaller than the Arab population of Palestine, the local Palestinians, and that to create a Jewish state, to carve out a Jewish state there, would mean the forcible expulsion, the ethnic cleansing of the majority of the Palestinians. And that's what ended up happening. When the Brits left, post World War II, the British Empire was exhausted and decided they didn't want to deal with this problem that they had created anyway. And they punted this question over to the United Nations, which had just recently been formed in the aftermath of World War II. And the UN voted to partition Palestine and give the majority of the land to the minority of the population, which was the Jewish population. Now, the Palestinians obviously rejected that. They had no reason at the time to accept the partition of their own country. The Zionist movement, led by David Ben-Gurion, who became Israel's first prime minister, accepted. And then, because unlike the kind of the UN diplomats, the Zionists understood exactly what it would mean to have to create a Jewish state in this land, they proceeded to expel 3/4 of the Palestinian population. And so, from the very beginning, the idea of partitioning this land into two different countries is predicated on the mass expulsion of the majority of the Palestinian population. What we have now is a situation where, for decades, the world leaders have said over and over that the only solution is a two-state solution, because you have to preserve Israel as it is, as a Jewish majority state, and then create a country in what's left of Palestine for the Palestinians. But this ignores the fact that the Israelis haven't sat on their laurels for the last 50 years. They've been actively colonizing and building onto the territory that the international community keeps saying is supposed to be a Palestinian state.
The thing I always think of when, whenever it's either a Democrat running for president or someone who's getting yelled at for saying something insane and terrible and going, what do you mean? I support a two-state solution. Is a quote-unquote two-state solution with Israel in its current form. Are you
talking about Josh Shapiro, Felix?
There's a legal injunction preventing me from talking about Josh Shapiro since the Kangol hat comment I made about him. But Josh Shapiro is a good example. This basic position where they support like a Palestinian Bantustan that would definitely not be permitted to have a military, much less be allowed to buy S-400s or S-500s for the equivalent like American Patriot systems, modern air defense systems necessary to defend their skies. I mean, we see how much Israel respects the sovereignty of three of its immediate neighbors for the last 15, 20 fucking years alone. Yeah. You don't even have to go back that far. A Palestinian state under the aegis of the people on the international stage that are pulling for it would just be a glorified weapons testing range.
Yeah. I mean, U.S. and Israeli leaders, the ones who kind of keep playing into the charade, have said over and over that one of the conditions of a Palestinian state would be that it has to be demilitarized, which is insane.
You can't have a state without a military.
Well, not just that, but in this specific scenarios, in the specific context of
and demilitarized would presumably apply to the Israeli military as well, I'm sure.
No, I mean the Israelis want to maintain a permanent military presence in the West Bank state as well. Yeah.
So we have a situation in which like the two-state solution is proffered as a solution to this terrible, irresolvable, and let us not forget, completely, complicated and impossible to decipher conflict. But like all that is really just papering over what the essential strategy from the jump is, which is the maintenance of a Jewish demographic majority in historic Palestine by any means necessary. And that necessarily entails a lot of violence. And as we're seeing now, increasingly wars against neighboring countries. And I want to bring up Lebanon because we started out the show talking about the sort of the propaganda term of referring to the Hamas-run Ministry of Health. And I see that not only are like many of the same propaganda terms being utilized now in terms of the Israel's aggression against Lebanon, we're hearing the term Hezbollah-run health ministry of Lebanon. And the thing that's funny about that is like you can technically say that the Gaza health ministry is Hamas-run because Hamas is the government of Gaza, but the Lebanon Ministry of Health is held by a party that is at best adversarial to Hezbollah. But like, what are we seeing now in Lebanon in terms of like, Israel's goals in expanding this war and opening up a new front? Is this, and once again, it comes back to this question of what their military objectives are, stated versus unstated. Is this a reflection of of a military goal, or is this a reflection of a lack of military goal and a lack of military objectives being achieved? That now they're just opening up a new front on the southern border of Lebanon.
Before we get into that, did you guys see that tweet by Netanyahu yesterday where he wrote, "I told you if you have a missile in your living room and a rocket in the garage to leave your house because otherwise you won't have a house." Did you guys see that?
Yeah, of course.
Of course, they were released a fucking ridiculous graphic of what it looks like when, I guess, just nuclear families in Lebanon, in South Lebanon, launch fucking stealth cruise missiles from their living room.
Are you saying that's not feasible?
Well, I mean, look, I'm not a homeowner myself, but I have burned down apartments in the past launching a fucking cruise missile with a turbojet air-breathing engine with an afterburner from my fucking living room and burned down the building. I don't know. Houses in Lebanon might be different. Who knows?
Well, I want to know why they would store missiles in the living room but rockets in the garage. What's the physical difference there?
Anywhere you got an extra room, if it's not being used by Airbnb, get some passive income storing missiles.
Air HZB, Air Hezbollah. Did you guys see? There was also that. I mean, look, if any other leader in the world wrote something like that, people just dismiss him as a raving lunatic. But Netanyahu was speaking at the UN today, and he's going to get a round of applause probably, and might even make it onto Jake Tapper's show. But there's also Naftali Bennett, who made his fortune in Silicon Valley, and was, I think, the last Israeli prime minister in between Netanyahu's two most recent stints. He wrote something like. He tweeted that the Shia population of South Lebanon has an alternative income stream where they rent out their rooms to Hezbollah missiles.
You can't, how do they think fucking missiles work? You can't just, lay a cruise missile on its side and, light the fuse like it's Looney Tunes. Presumably it just, the fucking afterburner does nothing to your house.
Yeah,
do you put is that the reason they put plastic over their couches like Italian families? Oh, we're launching the fucking cruise missile today. Better get the tarp out. It's so insane. It is so absolutely disqualifying from anything to say that with a straight face. But you're right. It's just will either get totally ignored or they'll find a picture of a missile launching cell in a building and be like, look, everyone made fun of it, but they're doing the fucking thing that we talked about.
I think one of the reasons we really need to ban AI art is because it's being used by the Israelis. Do you see the one where they posted a AI picture of Hassan Nasrallah just sitting on a couch
Yeah,
next to like some Lebanese lady, and there's a big rocket in between them.
It's like The Simpsons.
Yeah.
Did you see the really weird one today that it's Nasrallah inside an egg that's filled with yolk?
Oh yeah, that's supposed to be the leader of Iran.
Oh,
The Ayatollah Khamenei.
Yeah. There's not a lot of quality control going on here because that looked. I thought it looked exactly like Nasrallah. Like I don't. Yeah,
this guy with a turban and a beard. What do you want?
I think that like you could kind of judge the long-term viability of any political movement judged by like how much AI art they use.
Absolutely. Or yeah, I mean, actually, I was going to say, I think you can judge the long-term viability of human civilization at this point by how much AI art you encounter of a day. But Hezbollah is now the like primary adversary. I mean, it's Iran, Hezbollah, and then Hamas in terms of like orders of magnitude about how seriously a threat Israel considers them to be. But like similar to Hamas, Hezbollah was an armed movement that was created in the 1980s. That is to say, in all of our lifetimes. And it was a movement that came out of Israel's occupation of Lebanon during their first invasion of Lebanon in the 1980s. But
Their
like
second.
since their second invasion of Lebanon in the 1980s. But then their experience of that war and then like Hezbollah coming out of that, when they went into Lebanon in 2006, it was a very different experience. And in terms of like a semi-state actor, Hezbollah has created for itself like a fairly serious deterrence to Israeli aggression. However, that deterrence is being tested right now repeatedly. And there are a series of red lines in terms of Hezbollah's own internal or like publicly stated security doctrine that Israel has crossed in the last couple of months, at least in this conflict. How do you rate, like, it is a very difficult situation right now because they are clearly, I mean, they are not, Hezbollah does have missiles. They do have ballistic missiles that could reach Tel Aviv, civilian centers in Tel Aviv, but they have, it's been a tit for tat kind of, a rocket back and forth. They know have to make some response, but it is yet to be probably a fully proportionate response because they know that that's what Israel and the United States wants so that they can use that as a pretext to justify a much larger war. But like the difficulty there is strategically is at what point do you sort of, in the name of not wanting to escalate a war, invite further aggression by not responding or at least containing your response within certain boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, Hezbollah has had to walk a really, really tight rope over the last year. So on one hand, they have, on the day after October 7th, October 8th, they opened what they called a support front, where they started shelling Israeli positions across the border in the northern Israel. And they've been very clear about their goals with that, which is to put pressure on Israel to end the war in Gaza and come to a ceasefire. And they've repeatedly said, Hassan Nasrallah has repeatedly said, the day that a ceasefire is signed to end the war in Gaza is the day that we have stopped attacking in the north. So what Hezbollah has done is very, very explicitly tied its operations in northern Israel to what's happening in Gaza. And where the risk is that it has to do so at a rate that is below the threshold at which the back and forth between Israel and Hezbollah becomes a full-blown war in Lebanon. And the main reason for that is because Lebanon, probably even more than, up until maybe 2014, even Gaza, knows the extent to which the Israelis can be destructive and how murderous their wars are. The 1982 invasion that you mentioned was the bloodiest single Israeli attack in its history. It killed 20,000, I think 25,000 Palestinians and Lebanese. So, and then 2006 again, also extremely destructive. The Yahya doctrine, which is the Israeli military doctrine that is based on destroying civilian infrastructure as a way to put pressure on its military adversaries. That's named for Yahya, the southern suburb of Beirut. And it first came into effect in 2006 in that war. and then it's kind of been honed in Gaza. So Hezbollah's, like you mentioned, several red lines that Hezbollah had laid out as part of its deterrence over with Israel over the last 18 or so years have been crossed by Israel without Hezbollah responding in a way that you might expect it to do to maintain that deterrence. And I think the reason is because they have tried very, very hard to be disciplined in maintaining a modicum of pressure on Israel from the north to end its war in Gaza in the south without inviting a larger war in Lebanon. And it seems like we're heading very fast towards the failure of that strategy.
We have been talking like a bit about Hezbollah's general strategy and Iran's too. And like in part, I do think that people I don't know, they get a little too clever by half with this when they're like, they don't want to do it for this reason or that reason, when, you could just look at the fact that they live in Lebanon and maybe don't want to have like a full scale fucking regional war with strategic bombing campaigns in the place they live. It can be that simple. But I have been wondering if part of the Hezbollah strategy is that, like, I don't know, that like if this greatly expands and becomes like the confrontation that everyone has been kind of waiting for since about 2005, that their fear is if it's done now, that like America will almost assuredly intervene. I have been wondering if that's part of their calculation, just because, like, as you said, it really
Are you talking about Hezbollah's calculation?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fair to assume, and I think it's also a misnomer to say that the United States hasn't been involved.
Right.
I mean, the fact that the United States has also set out red lines for Israel, and and the red lines get bulldozed by Netanyahu every time, and Joe Biden responds by giving him even more weapons. So the United States, every time there's an escalation, there's an Israeli assassination of a senior Hezbollah figure or something like that, the U.S. response is to send more U.S. troops to the region or to send more military hardware to the region. So that is definitely part of the calculation. Like you said, there's a lot of people who get a little too excited about the potential of war between Hezbollah, all-out war between Hezbollah and Israel, because it would be destructive to Israel in a way that we've never seen before. But the flip side of that is that it would also be very destructive for Lebanon, and probably in magnitudes of order more destructive for Lebanon. So it's absolutely a calculation, and that's why I think Hezbollah has maintained such discipline. They've said the one thing that will not happen is that they will not decouple their support front from Gaza, no matter what happens. Everything else they will deal with, or they have decided to deal with, separately. So the response to the pager attacks or the massive bombardment of Lebanon earlier this week, 600 people killed in one day. The world went insane when hundreds of Israelis were killed on October 7th, but 600 Lebanese were just killed in one day, the other day, in Israeli airstrikes. And, the world just moves on and accepts it. That's the price to pay. That's escalation for the sake of de-escalation, right? And the other thing is Hezbollah has lost a lot in terms of fighters, of leaders. Organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas are designed to withstand that. They're designed to withstand assassinations of senior figures. They're designed to withstand the loss of fighters. But they've been taking it on the chin. And despite that, they've maintained that they will not cease firing on the support front from the north. Because what it's done is it has forced several tens of thousands of Israelis from the north to relocate, to leave their homes. It's created economic pressure on the Israelis as well, because a lot of industry and agriculture over there has been disrupted. And what Hezbollah is hoping is that will create enough internal pressure to force the Israelis to come to a ceasefire in Gaza. What we're seeing instead is that the risk is not the risk has always been that the Israelis instead will escalate, and therefore the support front will become an open front. And I think that's where we're heading right now.
Yeah, I mean, in a world with like rational actors both in Israel and America, it absolutely makes sense. And it is, it's just an impossible series of choices. I imagine that like everything that you think of can feel wrong in any instance, just because like, you know, the Israelis aren't quite rational actors, and the Americans certainly aren't. Like everything that like would have been punished under, you know, even Reagan or really either of the Bushes is just, it results in more weapons and more diplomatic cover, and it's a shit spot to be in.
It is, and we should also kind of note the fact that while what's happening in Gaza, I mean, I'm sure we'd all agree that what's happening is a genocide. And while that's been happening, the only form of pressure that the Israelis have been under have come from Yemen and Lebanon, and they've been punished for it. The Yemenis have been punished for it, and the Lebanese people are being punished for it. Rather than, you know, the world saying to Israel, "Okay, that's enough," or indeed ostracizing Israel for committing a genocide, it's the Lebanese and the Yemenis who are paying the price for trying to create some kind of pressure on the Israelis to end it.
Even like European countries that have like, at least on a rhetorical scale, not on like an actual practical or material way, but like they have at least acknowledged things beyond what like America or the UK will. Like France, they've still like deployed they've deployed their air force to Lebanon in the past like couple of months. So like, yeah, just even the countries that are like at least in just in public facing terms are reacting to this kind of rationally, are still in any material sense responding to this pretty much the same as America or Israel, the UK is.
Yeah, we're seeing like a complete, and I think at the end of the day, it's all going to flow from the United States, right?
Yeah,
like you won't find. This isn't 2003 where France and Germany, you know, contradicted the Bush administration when it came to Iraq, for example. And unfortunately, kind of everything seems to be stemming from Joe Biden. I mean, this isn't like support for Israel is institutional in this country. We know that. But as you said, things that would not have been tolerated by George W. Bush, by even Obama, as feckless as he was in many ways. I mean, Biden just seems to be rushing headfirst to embracing everything Netanyahu is doing. Biden is also, you know, you got to recall earlier this year, Biden, for example, said that the Israelis were indiscriminately bombing Gaza. That is a war crime, and the U.S. president casually admitted it. And U.S. law requires that any U.S. military assistance does not go to the prosecution of war crimes. But here we are, like all these laws, all these international institutions are being degraded, and people's belief in them is being degraded by the day as we're watching this genocide unfold in Gaza. And all these institutions are either failing or being made to fail so that Israel can continue this project.
I think that's a really important point that, like, in the absence of a rational U.S. government, the only calculus that is left to deter is further Israeli aggression or just to stop the killing is some sort of armed response, is a military armed resistance or group. And like, that's certainly not the only one, but in the absence of the United States doing anything to put pressure on Israel, the only, as you said, Lebanon and Yemen are the only countries that are putting any pressure on Israel whatsoever to stop this. And like, the consequences of any further war will continue to be ghastly. But what we've seen already is unbearable. So this idea that like, I don't know. I mean, it's just like when it comes to, I mean, because nobody like likes war, but like what options are left to the people of Lebanon or Palestine other than, like, in the absence of the United States doing anything other than some form of military action? I mean,
Yeah,
is there anything to be done?
Are you, clearly you're not a shareholder in Boeing or Lockheed Martin if you said no one likes war.
Well, I mean, at least just, you know, for public consumption, for our stated, public public diplomacy,
image,
for public diplomacy, as the State Department calls it. Yes, officially, no one likes war, but like but when you hear from the State Department who says we're trying every day to end this war, we need to have a ceasefire. Too many people have died. It's like our refusal to do anything to end this war is the cause of that. There is only one rational response. If you are on the receiving end of Israeli aggression, which is some form of armed resistance, you have to stop them somehow. and asking them to do it is not getting it done.
It's the only thing that's ever worked.
Yeah, and that's the terrifying thing, because I think the off ramp is there. It's been there since day one, which is a ceasefire in Gaza. I mean, you asked me earlier what the Israeli strategy in Gaza. There is no Israeli strategy in Gaza. There's no long-term strategy for what to do. But the war is kind of self-perpetuating, and so it has to continue. Now, the United States has had, over this past year, dozens of opportunities to say, okay, you've crossed the line now. No more bombs. You remember the World Central Kitchen bombing, right?
Mohammed, I think about that every week, because it's like every time we see like another school or refugee camp get shredded, the idea is here that they're like, they were actually terrorists, or when that excuse evaporates, then it becomes this idea that like, well, it's just an accident. Bad things happen in war, and the difference between Israel, the most moral army in the world, and Hamas and Hezbollah and these evil terrorist groups, is that Israel isn't actively trying on purpose to kill innocent civilians. They're just doing it wholesale as just like a more or less just as a function of their stated goal, which is killing terrorists. But the World Center Kitchen, this was like Obama's friends. And their convoy got triple tapped by missiles, and like on a route that they were driving, specifically cleared with the IDF. And this is reported on in the media. And I remember that story was a story for about a week, and it was, it made people angry or whatever. But it went away because the implications of it, if you think about it for longer than 5 seconds with an open mind, are unbearable to the U.S. government and the media. They cannot allowed to get the reality of what they did cannot be allowed to gain purchase, because if you think, if they intentionally killed international relief workers that were like invited into Gaza by Israel to feed people who are starving to death, and supposedly we can't allow that to happen. Of course, no one's starving these people on purpose. If they're willing to kill those people on purpose, what does that say to you about everyone else they've killed in this war?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the most horrifying things to think about. When I sit with it and I think about it, and every day I wake up, over the last couple of weeks, you wake up and the first thing you see is another school has been bombed, right? I mean, Jesus, I saw a man carrying a head walking out of the school that was bombed today. And, in any other conflict, that would be something that just kind of like knocks you back and becomes kind of the image of this war. But we've seen worse at any point during the last year. We've seen children killed by snipers. We've seen, Jesus, do you remember the girl who was killed during the Super Bowl in Rafah, whose body was just hanging off a wall?
Just hanging from a wall. Yeah, I remember that. I mean, like I could bring up any one of dozens of examples of images that are permanently seared into my mind of unimaginable horror that, like, once you take it on, can only be the result of one thing, which is the intention to kill as many people as possible. Now,
this notion of intention, the way this stuff is covered in the West by Western governments, by Western media in general, is that these are accidents, or there's no intention to do this, or there were terrorists there, whatever. But you don't hear that if you listen to what the Israelis are saying in Hebrew. When the Israelis are speaking to each other in Hebrew on their daily news program, they fucking invited the State of Taman, can't even say it, the State Taman rapist on evening news shows, talk shows. They have literal rapists on their talk shows defending their right to rape. When someone decided that these guys should potentially be prosecuted, and I'm 100% convinced they tried to prosecute them to stave off an international investigation rather than anything else. There were riots for the right to rape Palestinian prisoners led by members of the Israeli parliament. I work for AJ Plus, which is part of the Al Jazeera network, and we've lost so many colleagues over this last year. But one of the things that really sets apart my colleagues' coverage, especially on the Arabic channel, is they have a nightly segment where they just take clips from mainstream Israeli news programs every day, and they just play them with no commentary, just the translation. And it gives you such an incredible insight into what Israeli society is thinking, into what Israeli politicians are thinking, into how deep the dehumanization of Palestinians, especially in Gaza, is, and how intentional a lot of this is.
No, I was going to say, like, and there's a whole cottage industry in this country, or like in the West, of highlighting clips from like the Arab-speaking media to highlight like how insane and racist and anti-Semitic the things that get said in the Arab press are. But there is absolutely no presence in the American Western media of anything that is being said in the Israeli media, which is top to bottom: kill the cockroaches, kill the rats, exterminate them. All babies are terrorists. There is no such thing as an innocent Palestinian. Top to bottom, 24/7 on their media. So but then when you hear in our media is like, oh, well, when you see these horrible, unspeakable things unfolding, just know that it wasn't intentional. And in fact, it's this thin veneer of like, well, they're not trying to do that. It's just an unfortunate result of them bombing one of the most densely populated areas on the planet.
I think one of the things that has really shaken me as a journalist, as someone who works in this industry over the last year, is, I mean, I'm not naive to think that, every reporter and every journalist out there it has like an unimpeachable attachment to the truth, or seeking the truth. But when you see children's bodies being shredded on a daily basis, and instead you choose to not believe what your eyes are telling you, and to present to your audience something very disconnected from reality, then, I mean, it's just a shame that a lot of journalists, Western journalists, have decided that they want to be participants in Israel's war on Gaza. That's the kindest thing I can say about it. They want to be part of this.
Or like, they certainly know what team they're on.
Just to the end of like, not only are like the methods and the scope of permissible targets and everything from like how they run detention centers to how they persecute bombing campaigns, not only is that like extraordinary, but like the fact that like these are broader designs that they have for outside of Israel's current borders, for outside of, what they will say in English are their goals, that this is essentially their designs for as much of the world as they can take. It just, I can only speak for myself, but whenever anyone brings up like whatever like bad policy or thing that like Ansar Allah has done in the past, or Hezbollah for that matter, or anyone else, for me, it's just like, well, you know what? America was segregated, but we still cheered for fucking Easy Company. That's like anything else is just, there is no other comparable force like this with this kind of like expansionist, eliminationist ideology that has so few counterweights or anyone willing to face it. It is the only thing you can really compare it to is like the conduct of the Third Reich on the Eastern Front.
Yeah, I think just thinking about their tactics in Gaza right now, the fact that so the schools, I mean, it's almost like the schools are being bombed because there are thousands of people sheltering in the schools. The schools haven't operated in more than a year. Kids have not gone to school in a year because the schools are being used as shelters. The shelters get bombed. It's just this thing where it's like you cannot say that this is all accidental or the side effects of trying to target terrorists, because you only need to take 1 minute to step back and look at the big picture. When you destroy the health system by A, bombing the hospitals, B, killing hundreds of doctors, right? C, then carrying out airstrikes that leave thousands of people dead or buried under the rubble. D, those people then flee to schools, UN shelters, tents out in the street. E, you bomb those shelters. You cannot say that these are accidental or this is a side effect of war. This is very systemic. And the idea that this is, there's some kind of moral difference between what Israel and the Israeli army is doing and Hamas. I'm sorry, but even if we assume that Hamas did the worst of what it was accused of doing on October 7th, and we know a lot of what happened on October, what we initially were told happened on October 7th did not happen. But even if it did, it does not compare to what has been done to the people of Gaza over the last year in any way.
It's not even in the same galaxy. It's not
No.
even in the same galaxy. And, I mean, I guess like I was going to bring up Dana Bash and Jake Tapper and like, their role in like, because like, preserving the idea that what Israel is doing is just simply unintentional is like a load bearing aspect of U.S. propaganda. And I remember it was like months ago, but it was like Dana Bash was interviewing someone who then said, well, what about all of the Palestinian women and children that have been killed in like numbers far greater than those who died on October 7th? And Dana Bash said of Israeli soldiers, well, at least they're not raping them. And I thought, well, okay, well, I don't know how sure you should be of that, but also like, like let's take that as read. Is that some sort of is this some sort of moral escape clause for what they're doing? Is like, well, they are more or less killing them wholesale on purpose, but at least they're not, interfering with them sexually.
Yeah, I mean, I thought the Israeli army was the most moral army. So is that where the bar of morality is? That at least they're not raping them? That was, by the way, Pramila Jayapal that she was talking to.
Oh yeah,
it was Pramila Jayapal who said, thousands of kids have been killed, and Dana Bash said at least they weren't raped. And then when we saw evidence in the Israeli media of Israeli soldiers doing that raping, Dana Bash doesn't talk about that or ever bring it up. I mean, that's the modus operandi for these people, right? Jake Tapper, on the first time that Shifa Hospital was raided, rushed out an article on CNN's website. It was his byline, where he insisted that his intelligence sources told him that there's a Hamas Pentagon under Shifa Hospital. And it was funny, it stuck out to me because CNN actually they published it that night, but put a disclaimer saying they couldn't verify any of the information in this article, which is an insane thing to do.
Yeah, read the article, but hey, draw your, whatever. We can't really vouch for anything that's in it, but
But then when Shifa Hospital gets raided and no Hamas command and control center is found there, does Jake Tapper come out and say, hey, mea culpa? Or does he come out and say, actually, this is the updated information? No. This is the MO of these people. They will repeat anything, the most sensational shit that the Israelis are pushing, but will never, ever update you when facts contradict what they've been saying. It's a good thing that they were the ones who moderated the presidential debate, by the way. Those two.
Yeah. I don't know. Felix, I don't have much more. Do you have anything to close out with?
No, I think we hit on everything. It is just like obviously the most viscerally and like morally upsetting thing about all this is like the conduct of Israel. But there is just something like so unbelievably fucking frustrating about like American cable news, CNN in particular, with this. It's just like anything else in the world. This kind of conduct would at least like get you suspended from like a real media corporation. It is,
yeah. I mean, there was the lie they pushed about Rashida Tlaib just this week.
Yeah, and like they said that Rashida Tlaib said that the Attorney General of Michigan is ethnically biased in how she runs her office, which is completely not fucking true, obviously. But like when they like take it back or go like, I guess we were wrong, it's kind of like, well, okay, is anti-Semitism like a big deal or not? Is it like because the way that they characterize it when it turns out that this is completely fucking wrong is like, actually, like maybe she didn't, but like who knows? Who could know what anyone said?
Yeah.
Well, I think the interesting thing with that slander is the sleight of hand that was employed in terms of what Rashida Tlaib did say or did imply was that, like, in choosing to prosecute peaceful student protesters at pro-Palestinian solidarity demonstrations in Michigan's universities, and something that the Attorney General's office in Michigan had never done before ever for protesters, would seem to speak of an anti-Palestinian bias in her office. But the way in which, like, the very clear evidence,
bias. Sorry, yes. No,
but
you're right.
The way the very clear evidence of an anti-Palestinian bias is transmuted into implications of, like an anti-Semitic trope about, a dual loyalty or something that so that if you accuse someone of having an anti-Palestinian bias, you are in fact accusing them of as a Jewish person of catering to Jewish interests or something like that. Is that an anti-Palestinian bias is transmuted in the accuser into evidence of their bias and anti-Semitism?
I mean, that's they have to do this, especially around the campus protests, right? Because you cannot engage with what the protesters are actually being very clear and articulate about, which is stop fucking bombing children, right? You have to make it an anti-Semitic panic. That's why Dana Bash earlier this year went on TV and said that the atmosphere in the United States is reminiscent of 1938 Europe.
Well, she's right about that, but in the wrong direction.
Oh man! Well, it's a good thing that there's something called the Anti-Defamation League to protect people from defamation.
Yeah, thank God for that.
Yeah.
With Dana Bash or Tapper for that matter, I think it is just pure cynicism. I don't think that they actually believe that being Jewish in America in 2024 is actually fucking comparable to living through Kristallnacht. But there are people who legitimately have worked themselves up into believing that. And it is the most insane delusion that you're just not allowed to call out. Those people are as insane as fucking QAnon people to me. It's the same thing. It's you're finding hidden symbols and messages everywhere. When you see a fucking kafaya on Family Feud, you start adding Steve Harvey and asking him if he thinks the Holocaust happened. It's just as insane.
It really puts a new light on Steve's famous bit. Oh, Steve done shot the baby.
Hey, did you guys know Josh Shapiro and Jake Tapper went to the same high school?
Pennsylvania, undefeated.
Wait, what do we know about Jake Tapper? The worst article of all time?
Gangbanging in D.C.?
Yep.
Gang
Was this foundational for a young Josh Shapiro?
Do you think Josh Shapiro was practicing his Obama impression?
Yeah. He was doing it in the mirror like Rabbit in 8 Mile.
When Obama was just a college professor that only Josh Shapiro knew about, and he's like, this guy is so fucking cool.
Dude, I heard him. I read people saying he was trying to mimic Obama, and I was like, okay, I guess, whatever. And then I heard it.
Yeah, Mohammed, I could not fucking believe it the first time I heard him speak, which was a couple weeks ago.
I was like, wait,
God.
Is this AI? Did someone put Obama's voice on this shit?
My favorite thing he's done is when he's when he went even past Obama and he was like, few things inform my politics, my faith. And it's no Jewish guy has ever talked like that.
Yeah, no Jewish person has ever talked about their personal relationship with their faith and I'm standing on my faith here. No, that is not part of the Jewish tradition.
I don't be playing with no damn dreidel.
I suppose it's nothing but just bleak, grim inhumanity on this episode. But I guess as long as we're talking about Pennsylvania, let's end on a lighter note, which is, Felix, I know that you got a great deal of enjoyment out of the recent interview clip, or just John Fetterman being accosted by an angry former supporter, being called to task for his grotesque support of this genocide, but just seeing that absolute lurch struggle to breathe as he walks at a snail's pace. And it's just oh man, you're really getting me here. Just seeing him struggle to breathe and say even one word was very satisfying to me.
Yeah. When he for the first 2 minutes of being berated, all he can muster is you're weird, man. And then it's another 2 minutes of him being berated. My friend Larry on Twitter did point this out. He is out of breath, but he is at altitude, the second floor of the Philadelphia International Airport. It's very important. Thank you to Larry for pointing that out. But he, after 2 more minutes of this, of him just like staring ahead into space as he always does, he goes, "You're really getting me. You're a bad man." And it's like, what the fuck was he going? What is he? Does he mean like a bad man in like the like
I'm
how
a bad
would say
man.
it? Yeah, or like
Bad to the
literally
bone.
he's a bad person. I don't like it. It's so confusing, and like it really makes you appreciate how much of Fetterman's like his clippable moments are the result of like a staffer writing what to say on his palm. He has just got nothing. Like he produces like 1 word per minute on his own. He is one of the slowest witted people we have ever seen.
I mean, he's so slow that his staffer came out and criticized his comms person, and he still hasn't gone around to firing her.
Wait, which comms person? The one who was like, "Oh, I don't agree with Fetterman on everything."
Yeah, that one. Said
Yeah.
his view.
That's always good when you're in that your staff's communications person. He's like, yeah, I don't really agree with the person who's paying me to represent his positions publicly.
Another good sign is when your staffers are the only staffers on Twitter who just say, "I work for a senator."
Yeah.
Not telling you which one.
Yeah.
I can't. It's in my contract.
All right. Well, I think we should probably leave it there for today. Best of luck to Lurch and his ongoing medical difficulties.
He did get home, and his wife did affix a feed bag to his face. So like all is well. He fell asleep standing up as usual, and he's ready to tackle another day.
Yeah, I mean, look. Let's be honest. In 2024, defending Israel is hard. It's tough. It's a tough job. It takes a lot out of you. So, but you know, best of luck to anyone who's pursuing that political or career path right now.
Before we wrap, do you guys just kind of bringing it back to the beginning? You guys know where Eric Adams wants to retire, right?
Golan Heights. I mean, Mohammed, he missed his opportunity to retire there. It's going to be a while before he gets to buy his plot of land in Syria.
I think the problem is Turkish Airlines stopped flying to Tel Aviv temporarily.
He honestly, like, if he had woken up on Monday morning and booked a Turkish Airlines flight and just out of this country, if he had got El Al, Turkish Airlines, if he had just landed in Tel Aviv on Monday, and he started his new life in his new favorite country. And by the way, I love in that clip where he's talking to this guy about being a defender of Israel, and when he says like, "I'm going to buy a plot of land in the Golan Heights and I'm going to retire there," and he just goes, "I just love Israel so much. The people, the food, the dance. I love everything about it." And it's like, out of all the things, the dancing is great, but out of all the things you could say you love about Israel, the people and the food, come on, that just shows that he hasn't really been there.
Can I just?
I don't know. Have you not seen Israelis dance?
Well, the dance, I'm agreeing with that.
The thing I love about this Adams scandal, and like, we're going to talk about it more next Monday, I imagine, but like, just the fact that like he's like, okay, how will I get remunerated for my corruption? What's the hardest to trace thing in the world? Airline flights. There's no database or anything that any of these are in. Yeah.
Best of luck to the mayor. And by the way, if you're listening to the show in the New York City area, please join one of the pro Eric Adams protests that are spontaneously breaking out all over the city right now. I mean, we'll see if the
they're actually
we'll see if he sends the NYPD. But
I mean, my message to New Yorkers is, they're coming for you. He's just in the way.
Absolutely.
100%.
100%.
If you are a federal agent involved in the Adams case, mutiny right now. You will be supported.
We need a carnation revolution right now.
Yeah.
To support
Eric
Adams.
Always good to be back with you boys. It's always fun, by the way. Every time you guys ask me on, I have to let my executive producer, my managers just know. So I send an official work email It says, I have been invited by Mr. Chapo to enter his trap house again. So,
I hope to see that in a federal indictment one day. All right, once again, Mohammad Alsaafin, thank you so much for joining us. Chris, any business before we end up the show today?
Matt's book on sale Tuesday, October 1st, chapotraphouse.store. Movie Mindset returns next Tuesday. There's a blog post about it with the schedule on Patreon. And finally, our tickets for our November 4th Election Eve show with episode 1 are on sale for the general public tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Pacific time. I will tweet links to all of this.
Be there or be square.
Matt's book on sale October 1st.
Be there or be square. Buy Matt's book or don't get a second look. All right, till next time, everybody. Signing off. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
bye, guys.